We are on Daf Kuf Lamed Aleph Amid Beis 131b. Just the second to last line. We're in the midst of looking for sources for Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer is of the opinion that in our Mishnah that not only do you do a bris on Shabbos, but you also are allowed to do any preparatory work that's necessary in order to make a bris on Shabbos can also be done. And as we talked about, obviously it's only a bris on the 8th day. A bris that is not it's called a bris bismana, a bris in its proper time, which is on the 8th day, even though that it's obligated to be done. If the child couldn't be done, it couldn't be done on the 8th day for whatever reason, you still are obligated to do it throughout this person's life in order to make sure that they have a bris milah. But it would not supersede Shabbos. It would not be done on Shabbos or Yom Tov. And similarly, we saw that Rabbi Eliezer's opinion is say that you can cut down your lulav on sukkahs in order to have dalad minim, and you could cut down and you could build a sukkah, and you can make a shofar. All the other things that we saw in the Gemara before, besides for tzitzis and mezuzah, those were the exceptions. Everything is done on Shabbos. And so we had a source for each one. And now we're up to bris milah. Milah v'chol machshirei derech Shabbos. Bris milah itself and all of the machshirin, the prep work needed to be able to do a bris, supersede Shabbos, a Shabbos, different Rabbi Eliezer. That's the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer as we saw. Minolei Rabbi Eliezer, how does Rabbi Eliezer know this? Imi kulu, is he learning it from any of the others or the others before, which we saw that the cutting of the omer, barley stalks is done on Shabbos, and the shtei alechem, the two breads for Shavuos, the wheat breads that are done on Shabbos, and we had lulav, cutting down a lulav and building a sukkah, and making matzah, etc. All of these things. So is he learning it bris milah from there? In kulagama, kada amr, like we said. So va'id malahanach kadamrina, imi kulagama kadamrina. Va'id malahanach shekain im abazman batla. The halacha is that all of these other mitzvahs, as we said, it has its proper time, and there is no replacement time. You cannot sit in the sukkah. If you didn't have a sukkah on the first day of Pesach, first day of Sukkot, so then you cannot make that up. You missed it. If you didn't have matzah for the Seder, you cannot make that up. You missed it. If you didn't have a lulav, if you didn't have a barley for the omer, if you didn't have a wheat for the shtei alechem, these mitzvahs are specifically on that day. You missed it. But a bris milah, perhaps it shouldn't supersede Shabbos, or at least the machshirin. The if you didn't have a knife and you're gonna have to cut down trees to make to do the smith work in order to make a knife, that perhaps should not supersede Shabbos, because if you didn't do the bris on Shabbos, you can still do it on Sunday. So rather, this is the reason of Rabbi Eliezer. As it says in the pasuk, it says on the 8th day you will do the bris for this child, remove its foreskin. And that's even on Shabbos. As Rashi explains, the Gemara is going to tell us later that how do you know even a bris supersedes Shabbos? Never mind the making of a knife or bringing the knife, which is prep work, that would also supersede Shabbos. And the Gemara is going to tell us various opinions from where we know the basis of a bris itself is superseding Shabbos. And Rabbi Eliezer is going to go with the opinion that we know that a bris supersedes Shabbos as a halacha l'Moshe Sinai. That we don't need a pasuk for, because that's known as a halacha Moshe Sinai, as a tradition, as what the halacha is from Moshe to Yeshua, to the Zkenim, all the way from Sinai to us. So that we don't need a pasuk for. And therefore, the pasuk, when it says, Uvayom Hashmini, and on the 8th day, you will do the bris, that tells us that the 8th day is not only for the bris itself, but also for the prep work that's needed before. And we'll see more about, we need that basis, which is going to come in the Gemara in a few minutes. So the Gemara says, so the Torah should only tell us by bris milah that not only can you do the bris on Shabbos, but you can also do the prep work, like bringing the knife through a Rishus Harabim, a public domain, on Shabbos. And we'll learn all the rest of them, lulav, matzah, omer, etc. from there. No, bris is different. Perhaps the reason bris supersedes Shabbos, that even the prep work can be done on Shabbos, on account of that it says the Torah has 13 covenants, 13 brisos that were made of the bris milah. It says bris 13 times by Avraham Avinu to tell us that there are 13 covenants, 13 brisos that come along with this bris, with milah. And perhaps that's why it supersedes Shabbos. But all the other mitzvahs, maybe it wouldn't supersede Shabbos in this way. That's why Rabbi Eliezer needs a drash and needs a pasuk for each one of them. So Gemara now says, Al karchale pligi rabbanan aleder ela b'machshir milah. The Chachamim only disagree with Rabbi Eliezer in regards to the making of the knife and bringing the knife, the machshir and the prep work for the bris. But the bris itself, everybody agrees. Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim agree. That's done on Shabbos if the bris is on the 8th day. Ela machshir milah aval milah gufa devra Shabbos. But bris itself, everybody would say supersede Shabbos minolan. How do we know that? How did the Chachamim know that the circumcision itself is also Deicha Shabbos? Ama ula halacha. So Ula says halacha Moshe Sinai. V'chein Amar Rabbi Yitzchak halacha, and Rabbi Yitzchak also says halacha Moshe Sinai. And we have on the side v'chein Amar Ravasi halacha Moshe Sinai, v'chein Amar Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha halacha Moshe Sinai. So we have different Chachamim. They're all saying that it's halacha Moshe Sinai. Just as we know our tefillin, a square made of hide and it's black, it's halacha Moshe Sinai. So too, we know that a bris milah supersedes Shabbos and is done on the 8th day. It's done on Shabbos. Halacha Moshe Sinai. So we ask a question. Minayin lepikuach nefesh adeicha Shabbos. The Brisa says, how do we know that pikuach nefesh adeicha Shabbos? That if there's a danger to life, that supersedes Shabbos. And Gemara says we're going to make a kal v'chomer. So the Gemara is going to bring us in the next in the next lines, in the next sections, several forms of drash that are important. They are kal v'chomer. There's a logical conclusion based on the severity of one thing, where we see it supersedes another. It's more severe than another, so that tells us that it's a stronger obligation. That's one. Another form is where two words are compared. There's a hekesh, a comparison of the words from one to another, and they have different rules. But both of these would only apply to halacha, to something written in the Torah. They would not apply to halacha Moshe Sinai. If it's not in the text itself, if it's not in the written Torah, then we don't have these the forms of drash that we are able to see the meaning of the text. Obviously, halacha Moshe Sinai, you don't have that form. So the Gemara is going to challenge, if we make a kal v'chomer from bris, obviously bris is in the text itself, and not just halacha Moshe Sinai. So meisavei minayin lepikuach nefesh adeicha Shabbos. How do we know that pikuach nefesh supersedes Shabbos? Pikuach nefesh being the potential danger to life, that protecting life supersedes Shabbos. So Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah says, Ma mila she'achas me'vorav shel adam doiches Shabbos, just as circumcision, which is the completion or the fixing of one individual limb of a person, or an organ of a person, and yet the halacha is that it supersedes Shabbos. For sure, the entire body of a person, that the entire life of a person, which would supersede Shabbos. So that's Kal V'chomer. Now, and if you tell me the basis of bris milah itself is halacha, can I use a form of drash such as Kal V'chomer, even though it's a logical form of drash? It's by logic. I say, look, if this is enough to supersede Shabbos, for sure the entire body is enough to supersede Shabbos. But nevertheless, the Gemara says you can't do that if the basis of bris milah is only halacha, not in the text itself. So then it cannot be that you make a drash from there. And since the Brisa does, that tells us that there's a textual source for halacha for bris milah, and therefore we can make a drash, a Kal V'chomer for pikuach nefesh as well. Vatanya Amar Rabbi Elazar. So where do we know that you cannot make a drash from a halacha? Vatanya we learned Amar lo Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer responded to Rabbi Akiva, and this is in regards to the measure amount of a deceased that would make a nazir tummy. So we know that the various form of tumah come from a deceased person, an intact deceased person, but not only intact, but even parts of a deceased person would cause tumah. So the amount of a bone, of a limb that would make a person tummy is a kisa'ora, which is like a barley size. It's just small size, and the amount of blood is a revius, let's say 3 ounces. So we make a Kal V'chomer, and Rabbi Kiva said a Kal V'chomer. How do we know that a revius of blood is sufficient to make a nazir tameh, and he would have to go through the tahara process and restart his nazir count? So somebody accepted to be a nazir, keep away from wine and not cut his hair and not be tameh for 30 days. And he's in the midst of that 30 days and came into contact with a revius, a full quarter lug, which is, let's say 3 ounces, full 3 ounces of blood of a mace. So the halacha is that he would have to start his tahara process, purify himself, and then restart his 30 days of nazirus. So how do we know that? So he says it's a Kal V'chomer, it's a logical conclusion. If a bone is enough enough to be tummy, is the size of a barley, but that tumah does not make ohel, does not make is not sufficient to cause tumah. It'll only cause tumah by touch or by carrying it, by not being in the same under the same roof. So that we see that's a lesser degree of tumah, because it will only make tumah by touch and by carrying, but not under the same roof. Yet a revius of blood is sufficient to cause tumah within when it's under the same roof. So then for sure by touch and by carrying, and that's a logical conclusion. But Rabbi Eliezer responds and says, well, how do you know that? How do you know that etzem kasa'ora, that a bone the size of a barley is sufficient to make such a tumah? You only know that from a halacha. That's not in the text. That's halacha Moshe Sinai. And you can't make a Kal V'chomer from a halacha Moshe Sinai. So he said, Akiva, etzem kasa'ora matame halacha. The fact that a bone is sufficient to cause tumah by carrying it or by touching it in the size of a barley, that's a halacha Moshe Sinai. Or revius dam, and the fact that you want to say that a blood of a deceased in the measure of revius, 3 ounces, would be sufficient to cause tumah to a nazir, that's a Kal V'chomer. That's a logical conclusion based on that the blood at the measure of revius is a greater tumah because it also applies in a tent. Well, But in done in kavachomer ma'alacha, you can't say a kavachomer extrapolation from halacha Moshe Sinai. And so we have over here halacha Moshe Sinai. It's true that the halacha is that a bone the size of a barley is sufficient to cause tumah for a nazir, but you cannot extrapolate from that, and you cannot deduce from that and say that it would apply even to a revius. And therefore, we see this concept that halacha Moshe Sinai cannot be the basis of a kal v'chomer. Yes, Michael.
Side question, but I mean, we see come up all the time. The standard.
Sorry, I had headphones and I didn't hear you. Try that again. Sorry.
And the standard measure for liquids is generally speaking revius and all sorts of applications. Why is it that what's different about here that they're challenging a revius from? Where do you know a revius from? Revius is all over the place. That's like the minimum liquid requirement. All sorts of things. Why here are they asking a question on
it? We don't have revius for generally for in Tuma. We have that. It's true. It is a general application for consumption of something. Tuma has its own rules, and you have in Tuma you have very different. Like you have an olive size is a general rule when you're consuming something, but when it comes to Tuma, olive is not a general thing at all. So the same would be for liquid Tuma. The idea that revius would be a standard size is not an assumption at all. In any case, what we have is that Tuma Kal V'chomer is only to bring us the concept that Rabbi Eliezer is telling Rabbi Akiva, you cannot make a Kal V'chomer based on a halacha Moshe Sinai. Elo Amar Rabbi Eliezer. So rather, Rabbi Eliezer says, you're right. That's not the basis how we know that you do a bris on Shabbos. It's not halacha Moshe Sinai. Rather, asya os os. Rather, we're doing a hekesh. We're going to compare the words. The Torah called Shabbos a sign of the connection, a symbol of the connection to Hashem, and bris milah is an us. It's a symbol of the covenant to Hashem, and therefore they are done on the same day. Elamiata, so the Gemara says if that's the case, tefillin so then tefillin should also have to be done on Shabbos because it says us. If you tell me that since they're both called him us, they're a sign of the covenant, well then tefillin also is, the Torah calls it us. It shall be a sign on your arms, so you should have to wear tefillin on Shabbos. And in fact, that may be a reason you don't need to wear tefillin on Shabbos because you already have the sign of the covenant on based of Shabbos. So I don't need to wear tefillin, so maybe I don't do bris on Shabbos either on account of that. Ella asya bris. Well, then rather the idea is because it's called a bris, a covenant, and Shabbos is called a covenant, and so that's why since it is a covenant. And therefore, you do it on Shabbos. The Gemara says, well, if that's the case, not only on the 8th day, but every day, every bris, even as an adult bris, should be done on Shabbos. The whole basis that you're saying for bris is that bris supersedes Shabbos. It has nothing to do with with the 8th day. Then even an adult bris, even if it was delayed, it should also be done on Shabbos. Nechsiv bei bris, because there too it says bris. So litri Shabbos, so let it supersede Shabbos. Ela asya doris. So rather, where it says on the 8th day you shall do a bris l'dorasechem for your generations, and Shabbos also says generations to tell you that bris is done on Shabbos. Well, tzitzis tachsib doris litri Shabbos. What about tzitzis? It also says that you should put the tzitzis on your four-corner garment l'dorasechem for your generations. So that should also supersede Shabbos. Elamar Nachman Yitzchak done an ois bris v'doris me'ois bris v'doris. It's the Rio. It's this trio of covenant, sign of the covenant. Now, for your generations, those three words, ois bris and Torah, which are specifically by bris and specifically by Shabbos that tell us that just as Ois, Bris, and Torah are written by Shabbos, and just as it's written by bris, so just as this is done, Shabbos is done on Shabbos, obviously, so the bris is also done on Shabbos. So Rav Nachman Yitzchak says the basis is because it says these three words, and we make the word comparison. Whereas it excludes the other, it excludes tefillin and tzitzis, where it only says one of them, but it doesn't say all of them. Rabbi Yochanan has a different basis. How do we know a bris supersedes Shabbos, that you do a bris on the 8th day, even on Shabbos? Because it says, it says in the pasuk, and you will do the bris on the 8th day. To tell you on that day, even on Shabbos. Amalei Rish Lakish Rabbi Yochanan. Rish Lakish challenged Rabbi Yochanan. El mi'ata, if that's the case, mechusu kapara, dechsibuhu beyoy, achanami dedach Shabbos. Somebody who's a mechusa kapara. We've learned this a few times. There are tahara processes that require simply going to the mikvah. And then as soon as a person goes to mikvah, they're tahar. There are tahara processes such as to come to the Beis HaMikdash, that even after you've gone to the mikveh, you still need to wait for the sun to set. And then the next day only may you come to Beis HaMikdash or eat teruma, etc. That's a Tavul Yom. Somebody went to the mikveh that day. And then there are tahara processes where it's not enough to have gone to the mikveh, and even for the sun to have set, meaning a new day, the next day they still need to bring a korban, and only then is their tahara process, is their purification process complete. That's called mechusre kapara, somebody who still needs the kapara, the atonement korban. And they are still considered somewhat tamei at that point, and cannot do come to Beis HaMikdash or eat teruma or eat kachim, etc. So somebody who's a mechusar kapara, their 8th day of tahara process comes out on Shabbos, and for them that means that they would have to bring a korban on Shabbos, but they can't because it's Shabbos and it's not an obligatory korban of the day, and therefore it doesn't supersede Shabbos. But it does say on their 8th day they should bring the korban. Perhaps they should bring it specifically the 8th day and even on Shabbos, just as you say the bris milah, where it says Uviyom Hashmini Yimol B'Sar Lose. On the 8th day, you should do the bris, circumcise the foreskin. So therefore, it has to be done even on Shabbos. Well, then mechusar kapara, and someone who is in the Tara process and needs a korban on the 8th day, it should be done even on Shabbos, and that's not the halacha. They do not do it on Shabbos. There we needed to tell you that their korban needs to come during the day and not at night, but it's not done. It's not there to tell you that it comes on the 8th day. So it can come on the 9th day as well. But day there, the word b'yom is not to tell you specifically the 8th, but rather it's there to tell you it should be done during the daytime and not nighttime.
Shlishi and Shvi is Doche Shabbos?
Sorry?
Shlishi and Shvi Doche Shabbos?
The spritzing?
Yeah.
Well, yes, it would, but that's not a malacha. There's no malacha being done. It requires malacha.
Yeah. But it's Doche Shabbos.
Well, it's not docha. It's done on Shabbos. It's not a docha is usually the word for something that's prohibited, but the mitzvah supersedes Shabbos. What malacha is being done and spritzing on this person? You take a finger, you spritz some of the red heifer water. What's
Misakin the person?
That for sure would at best be the rabbinic the completion of the person. The person. There's a question of whether that applies even, but in the most severe rabbinic. So in any case, So we have this. We have a question: what is the teaching of Bayom in regards to mechusik kapara? And so we say that's to tell you by day and not by night. So bris, we also need the teaching Bayom to tell you that a bris is only done by day. A bris cannot be done during the nighttime. No, we have a second pasuk to tell us that it has to be done by day, because it says ben shmonas yamim, someone of the someone who was 8 days old, but it says days. Well, there's a second bayom as well over there in regards to mechusik kapara. It says bayom, the day of that he's commanded to do so, on the day that Moshe commanded him to bring the karbanos. Now, I still need a special teaching. Even though generally we know that a carbon has to be done by day, I may have thought this is a unique type of carbon, because we know that there are certain carbonos, regardless of one's means, the level of carbon is what they need to bring. A lamb is a lamb, a ram's a ram, etc. Whatever it is, they have to bring. Certain carbonos, the Torah was lenient and said if the person is not a person of means, then they can bring a lesser degree of carbon. So, since the Torah said that he can bring a lesser carbon if he's poor, so perhaps, so we see the Torah is being lenient on this person to try and help him get his atonement and complete his tahara process. If that's the case, so perhaps not only is the Torah being lenient and giving him a lesser carbon to bring, but the Torah is also being lenient and said, you know what, you can bring this one at night. And the fact that generally karbanos must be done by day, that's not enough to tell us that a mechusik kapara's carbon needs to be done by day, because maybe since the Torah is being lenient and says that he can bring a lesser carbon if he can't afford it, so he can also bring it by night. That's why I need a special teaching by this carbon to say by Yom that it has to be done by day, not by night. Well, if you're telling me that this is a lesser carbon, or the Torah is being lenient in this carbon to allow it to be brought in a lesser carbon, or a smaller carbon, a cheaper carbon for somebody who's poor, well, then maybe if that's the case, the Torah's leniency should apply also that a non-Kohen can bring it, or even a Kohen, but even when he is an onen, meaning when an immediate family member died prior to the burial, where generally we say that an onen may not do the avodah, but for this carbon, since the Torah is lenient, maybe other leniencies apply. Ha'adre cross. Gemara says no. You're right. That generally we would say once the Torah made a leniency for it, we could say other leniencies as well. But since the Torah also put it back into place and said that it doesn't apply to nighttime, and now the Torah put it back and say, well, that means that other leniencies do not apply. It's only the one leniency of Dallas, of that a poor person can bring a lesser, a cheaper carbon. That's all that applies, but the Torah put it back into its place, meaning that all other halachas of carbon would apply by saying that it must be done by day, and therefore it also must be done by a kohen who is not a noni. Amar Rabbi Yaakov Amakra. Rabbi Yaakov says he has another basis for a bris milah being done on Shabbos. Amakra, it says in the pasuk, Shmini. Shmini afilu b'Shabbos. It says the eighth day even if it's on Shabbos. So Amar says, Hi Shmini mibayla l'miyuti shvi. No, that just means there. It doesn't mean to tell you that even on Shabbos. It just means 7 full days have to pass. It shouldn't be done on the 7th day. Shvi mi ben shmonas yom nafka. Now we have already another pasuk for that. It says on the 8th day. Well, one is there to tell you can't do it earlier, and one is to tell you that you shouldn't do it later. The because if it only said one, I would say, okay, the 7th day, it can't be done. But because the time hasn't come yet. But on the 8th day and onward, it's already its time. And therefore, I need both of the psukim. So we can't say the answer of Rabbi Yaakov that we learn it from Shmini, the 8th day, because the 8th day actually is needed to tell you not the 7th and not the 9th. And therefore, yes, the 9th if you missed it, but that's not the mitzvah. The mitzvah should be done on the 8th. So that doesn't tell me that it should be done on Shabbos. Rabbi Yochanan. So rather, it's better to say like Rabbi Yochanan that it's there ubayom, the day, meaning the day of the 8th is the proper time and not after and not before, and therefore it's done even on Shabbos. Tanaka said Rabbi Yochanan. We have a brisa indeed that concurs with Rabbi Yochanan that we learn it should be done on Shabbos on the basis of ubayom. But to like a Rabbi Yaakov, not like a Rabbi Yaakov, because it says Shmini Imo, on the 8th day you shall do a bris. Afilu b'Shabbos. That means even on Shabbos. Umani mekayim chalem ma'asiyum. So what about where the Torah says you can't do work on Shabbos? B'sham melachas. That's other prohibited acts, creative acts. Chutz mimila. Besides for a bris milah on the 8th day. Or maybe that's not true. Elo afilu milah. Maybe bris milah is also included in the prohibition. Umani mekayim shmini. And what's the meaning of the 8th day? Shmini imo chutz mishabbos. Besides for Shabbos. Tamalema b'yom. Therefore, we have the extra teaching of Yom to tell you that not only does it need to be on the 8th day generally, but even on Shabbos, it'll be on the 8th day. Afilu b'Shabbos. What was the back and forth here? What did he understand first? And what was his question on himself? That he said in the end, we learned from Bayom to tell you that should be done on Shabbos. So Hachikama, this is the filler to understand the brief dialogue in the brisa. Shmini Imel, the Torah says on the 8th day you should do bris milah. Afilu b'Shabbos. I would think that means even on Shabbos. Umani mikayim chalem ma'asiyumas b'sham melachas. And when the Torah says that you can't do work, that's a capital crime. That's to tell you other creative work. Chutz mimila, besides for bris milah of the 8th day on Shabbos. Aval milah dachim. But bris milah would supersede Shabbos. My time. And what would be the basis that was so simple to the Tana that he understood that? Kavachomer. It's a logical conclusion. Now, for this Kavachomer, we need to understand a few things. The bris, the Torah says that it's a ras, which we call leprosy. It's not the leprosy of the ailment that we know, but we have this tsaras, which we call leprosy. The Torah prohibits removing that tsaras. If somebody has a tsaras, they must go to the Kohen and show it to the Kohen, and they may not remove it. Hishomer ben nega tsaras. The Torah says you may not remove it. Yet, if somebody needs a bris, and on the foreskin there's a tsaras, you're allowed to remove it because the mitzvah of bris milah supersedes tsaras. So that's step one. Bris milah supersedes tsaras, and we know. In the strength contest of mitzvahs, the bris is a stronger mitzvah than tsaras, the halachas of tsaras of leprosy. Another strength contest. Well, which supersedes which? Can a kohen who's obligated in doing the service in the Beis Hamikdash, who has tsaras, is he obligated, or does his obligation of the service in Beis Hamikdash supersede tsaras or not? No, tsaras will exempt him, or not exempt him, will not allow him to do the service, which is a mitzvah. So we see that service in the Beis Hamikdash is lesser than tsaras. So ma tsaras shadechas avodah. Tsaras, which is stronger enough to set aside his obligation of doing the service in the Beis Hamikdash. Kuf lamed beis lamed beis now, 132b. And avodah itself, in regards to Shabbos, the service of the Beis Hamikdash, we do that even on Shabbos. So lighting a fire in the Beis Hamikdash and lighting the candles in the Beis Hamikdash and doing shchita of the korban in the Beis Hamikdash, it all supersedes Shabbos. So in the hierarchy here we have bris milah is stronger than tsaras, because you would do a bris even if it removes the tsaras. And tsaras is stronger than the service in the Beis Hamikdash because a kohen who has tsaras may not do the service even though he has the mitzvah. And the service in the Beis Hamikdash is stronger than Shabbos because we do the service even on Shabbos. So in the hierarchy, for sure, bris milah is going to be stronger than Shabbos. Shabbos milah so therefore, milah, which can supersede Tzaras, Shabbos, Shabbos, which is lesser, is set aside on account of the service, and Tzaras can set aside the service. Then for sure Shabbos can set aside. For sure Bris Milah can set aside Shabbos. In addition, Milah dechasa. So that seems like a good kal v'chomer. So what's the perhaps not. The Kama Hada Amar, he said no, maybe that's not true. Tzaras chamura. Who tells you that tzaras is really stronger than the service of the avoda? Maybe tzaras is lesser, and you know why the kohen can't do the avoda? Not because the tzaras is stronger, but because he now is a tamei person. He is not available for the service because he's tamei. Not because tzaras itself is stronger, but because he's not worthy anymore. He's not he's tamei. When tzaras chamura dilma Shabbos chamura, perhaps Shabbos is really stronger. And the reason it would be stronger is because Shabbos is stronger. Is because it has many prohibitions and many and it has kares. And why is it? So here we're going to skip the parentheses. Inami. It's not clear whether there's two answers or one. We're going to read it as one. And how do I know that tzaras is lesser? Mishum dechamira tzarasi dil megavra hu delechazi. And tzaras itself is not because it's stronger, but rather because the person himself can't do the service because he's a tamei kohen, and then when he's tamei, can't do the service. So therefore, why is it the eighth day? Chutz mishabbos. Maybe it means the eighth day besides for Shabbos. Therefore, I can't learn it from the Kal V'chomer, and I must learn it from the extra word by yom to tell you by day. On the eighth day, even if it is Shabbos. Afilu b'Shabbos. Tana Rabbanan, who have a brisa, mila deches tzaras bein b'zmanav and shalem b'zmanav. This concept that we said before that tzaras may not be removed, but yet if the bris will remove the tzaras, if the circumcision will remove the tzaras, it's done nevertheless, and regardless of whether it's done on the eighth day or any other day. And you can't say, look, you've already delayed the bris 10 years. This child is 10 years old, so you can't remove the tzaras now by doing the bris because it's already delayed anyhow. So delay it until after this. No, bris can supersede tzaras. Milo dechas tzaras bein b'zmana bein shalav b'zmana. Yontav ein dechela b'zmana. A bris can only supersede yontav on the proper time. A delayed bris cannot be done on yontav. Menahani mili. How do we know that? The Tana Rabbanan. We have a brisa that goes similar to the previous brisa. Yimel b'sar las, it says you'll do a bris milah on the flesh of his foreskin. V'yafal pisheish sham beheres yikuts, and even if there's a leprosy there, if there's a tzaras there, yikuts, it needs to be removed. But what about the Torah's prohibition of removing a tzaras? That's anywhere else besides for the bris. Or perhaps that's not true. Even if there's a tzaras on the foreskin, you may not remove it. But what about the mitzvah of bris milah? It's only when there's no leprosy there. If there's a leprosy there, it may not be removed. Therefore, we learn it from the extra word in the flesh. It should just say yimol arlasa. He shall circumcise the foreskin. Why say the flesh of the foreskin? Now, for B'Yishayesha to tell you, even if there's a wound, let's call it, in the flesh, a tzaras, you remove it. Well, what was the conversation here? What at first did the Tana understand, and what was his question? So here's what the conversation goes. Yimel b'sar lase, the Torah says that you do a circumcision on the flesh of the foreskin, even though there's that would indicate to us, even if there's a tzaras. But what about the Torah saying that you should not remove a tzaras, a leprosy? Let's talk about other places, besides for Mila. But Mila would, the circumcision would supersede the prohibition of removing a tzaras. My timer, what's the reason? The aser kal v'chomer, because I have a kal v'chomer. Shabbos is a very important mitzvah, and it has many mitzvahs. And yet, bris milah is done on Shabbos, like we saw before. Uvayom Hashmini tells us it's done on Shabbos. Tzaras lekoshakin, tzaras, which is a lesser degree than Shabbos, because it doesn't have as many mitzvahs as we saw before in the Gemara. For sure, bris milah that can supersede Shabbos can for sure supersede tzaras. Omaya einay. So why did he retract that? Why did he say, no, perhaps that's not correct? And this is what he said. How do you know that Shabbos is stronger than tzaras on account of that it has so many mitzvahs and so many prohibitions? Maybe tzaras is stronger because, as we saw before, tzaras can supersede the avodah. The Kohen who has the obligation to do the service in the Beis Hamikdash, nevertheless, tzaras will supersede that and not allow him to do the service. And service is stronger than Shabbos because the service in the Beis Hamikdash, the avodah in Beis Hamikdash, is done even on Shabbos. So that tells us in the hierarchy, tzaras is stronger than avodah, and avodah is stronger than Shabbos. So tzaras is stronger than Shabbos. And that's why I need the teaching to tell you basar, the extra word flesh, to tell us that that bris, the circumcision, will be stronger and supersede tzaras. We have another version of what the strength over here is of Mila. So Mila dechas tzaras my time asi asay v'dachilas. Bris Mila supersedes the tzaras on a general halacha. Generally, we say when you have a contradiction of an obligation and a negative commandment, a positive commandment, do this, and a negative commandment, don't do that, even though they're not specific to each other. But when they collide, meaning where you cannot do the mitzvah without transgressing the prohibition, asay dochalos asay. The positive commandment supersedes the negative commandment. For whatever reason, and the Gemara at the beginning of Yevamos has a lengthy few daf to explain this, but that's the halacha. Asay dochalos asay. We learn it from, let's say, tzitzis. The Torah says that you have to wear tzitzis and put a techeles. You have to put a blue wool thread on the corner of your garment. And a garment means even a wool garment. And we know that wool and linen may not be mixed. Yet, for this mitzvah, the mitzvah of techeles, of tzitzis, supersedes the prohibition of not mixing wool and linen. So therefore, and that's only in the blue thread for sure, but that's the idea. So we see asay dechalos asay, and that's why the bris milah will supersede the prohibition of not cutting away a tzaras. Well, that seems a very good a good halacha, because after all, we have a positive commandment of bris milah and a negative commandment, and a general rule is asay dechalos asay. This is what he says. It's only if there's simply a negative commandment, the positive commandment, the asay, will supersede that. But over here, we actually have a double commandment in tzaras. There's a positive commandment and a negative commandment. There's a positive commandment as well that the Torah says that you have to follow the ruling of the Kohen who says that you're tamei. So therefore, since the positive commandment is not sufficient to supersede the negative commandment, because it's not simply a negative commandment, it's a positive and a negative. And of course, you can't have one positive supersede a positive and a negative. So therefore, and therefore, I would think that you can only do a bris if there's no tzaras there. That's why it says in the flesh, even if there is a tzaras, you can do the bris because it says in the flesh an extra word. Well, maybe that's only by adult, where it says by the adult that katan namik sebe basar. So the Gemara says it says by an adult and by a child basar do the bris in its flesh. What about an in between? a child on the 8th day, it says you'll do a bris in its flesh. An adult, where it says the punishment of kares for someone who doesn't do a bris, it says someone who didn't do a bris in his flesh. So we have the flesh in both of those. But at what age is somebody punishable by kares? At 20. At what age is the bris on its 8th day? At the proper time, the 8th day. But in between, from the 8th day until he's worthy of punishment, how do we know that a child at that age also you would be able to remove a tzaras? Because there, that doesn't have the extra word basar. Amabaya asmi ben migadol asir shekein anish kares migadol asir shekein mila bezmana atzad shavish ben shekein mila v'dechnes tzaras of kol shekein mila v'dechnes tzaras. So Abaya says we learn it from a mahatzad. What's the common denominator between the two? We have a child on the 8th day. You tell me, oh, maybe that's because it's bris in the right time. That's why you can remove the tzaras. Well, an adult is true as well. Well, by an adult, maybe it's because he has kares, because it's such a severe punishment of the soul cut off from its source. Okay, so then we say, well, but by an infant, that's not the reason. What is the common denominator? Why by both do we say that it supersedes the tzaras? You can't tell me it's on account of the kares punishment because an infant doesn't have that. And you can't say it because it's on the correct time, because the adult doesn't have that. Must be, it's just because bris milah supersedes even tzaras. That's the way Abaya says it. Tomorrow we'll see Rava's response to this and continue the conversation of bris superseding tzaras.